Expressed in the following program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of KSMQ Public Service Media Incorporated or its assigns.
Thank you for joining Farm Connections. I'm John Wiedenheft, and tonight I'm pleased to introduce Gene Kuntz tonight, and he's here to discuss some of the rich history of farming in the upper Midwest. And you can call in right now and ask your questions. The number will be at the bottom of your screen. So Gene, thanks for joining us tonight, and tonight the main topic is the evolution of farming, the history of farming here in the United States. Why don't you start us off with, are we going to be talking about Egyptians and the very beginning of domestication, or where are we going to be starting tonight?
Well, thanks for the invitation here tonight, John. I look forward to the next half hour and talk about things that are near and dear to me, and that's, how did we get to where we are today in Midwestern agriculture being the most powerful thing that the world has ever seen in that respect, and it had small beginnings, and it certainly did back in the Colonial Period, and that's where we're going to start with it and go from there.
So we're starting with the Pilgrims. We're starting with the Mayflower.
No, a little later than that.
Okay.
During the mid 1700s, it was the settlements of all the colonies, the original 13 colonies, and at that time was subsistence farming or agrarian agriculture.
So basically, my family is going to farm enough to feed my family and get me through the winter. And
exactly, okay. That was the major occupation and emphasis of everyone was feeding themselves, and if there was a little bit left over, then that would be allowed for villagers and things like that. But a lot of food and goods that were relied on by the aristocrats had to come over from Europe.
Okay.
And it was tough going. But there were some things occurring. One individual called Jason Elliott, who was a preacher and a scientist, and he was starting to take a more scientific approach to it. I mean, he looked at a lot of the hillsides that were eroding and thought, there's got to be a better way to do this. So he started doing some experiments in terms of raising grasses and forages along with the grains and doing some variety selection, and then wrote a book about it and started raising awareness about, we can be more efficient about this and raise more food by the way we do things. Mm-hmm. And then the first Society of Agricultural People started in 1785 in Philadelphia. And you got to remember, everything kind of started out. It happened around Washington, D.C. or Philadelphia. That's where all the people were. We started getting journals put out. 1819, the American Plowboy, the American Farmer, the Plowboy, the New England Farmer. And it was this movement, too, that really started the birth of our exhibitions and fairs, county fairs, really started during this period because it was a show and tell thing. People would come to show their livestock. And
you wanted to show off your big cow.
Oh, exactly. But there was always a big sharing of information.
Yeah.
And people would go, wow, I like that cow. And they'd barter a deal, they sell it, and the cow would go somewhere else. And it would just, so fairs have been around us for a long, long time.
Okay.
200 years. And it just kind of, and they keep going.
Yeah.
They keep going. They've changed their emphasis some, but the original intent was an exhibition. And then we kind of lollygalled around, and remember this time, there's only 4 million people on the eastern seaboard. That was it. Okay, that's 1780, somewhere in there. And, 70 years later, 1860, 1850, we had 23 million people in this country. 4 million to 23. And in that period of the 1750 to the 1900s, mass immigration of people from Europe coming into the United States industrial centers and coming here to farm.
Exactly.
And people coming in to work the packing houses in Chicago and to work the textile mills in the East Coast and coming to the Midwest to farm. and our doors are open for it. And
how did all that immigration, how did that change farming? Obviously, you're talking 4 million people, and a lot of that was subsistence. So you're adding 20 million people 50, 70 years later.
Right.
What did that do?
Well, the first administration to recognize the importance that agriculture couldn't be agrarian anymore, couldn't be subsistence, had to become an industry was under the Lincoln administration.
Okay.
He appointed the first Secretary of Agriculture, Isaac Newton, in 1863. There wasn't a Department of Agriculture prior to that. So it got to that level, and he recognized, that administration recognized the importance that these people weren't going to stop coming. And we had to feed these people.
Right.
If we were going to become the great nation at that point in time that we thought we were going to be and would be. And so in 1862, out of the administration, and everyone I think has heard about the Homestead Act.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, $1.25 for an acre, 160 acres, stay on in 6 months, it's yours.
And these were the huge races where they had the shotgun starts and they ran out.
Right.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the Homestead Act?
Yeah, sure. In fact, the one that you're referenced to, and I think everyone's seen that movie, I can't remember, was...
I think it's like Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise and the Australian actress. What's her name?
Nicole Kidman.
Nicole Kidman, yeah, exactly. That was the last Homestead race, in fact, because that was the Cherokee Strip in Oklahoma. Cherokee Strip because they were initially given to the Cherokee and taken away, and that was but see, that was 1890 somewhere, late in this thing, because the Homestead Act really ran for about a 20-year period.
And the first ones started a little
1863, 1865,
and a little more east from there.
Yeah, most of the settled areas that we live in, the Dakota Territory, Minnesota Territory, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, Kansas, Nebraska. Those are primarily the homesteaded properties. Everything east there was already pre-settled. Okay. I mean, we had to figure out a way in that Homestead Act. It broke up 400 million acres of ground.
Wow.
And it was a big deal. At the same time, the railroads were giving huge tracts of land to connect the country. Okay. Huge swaths of land. And at the same time, universities were given the Land Grant Morrill Act.
Right.
I looked my property up by North Morristown, Minnesota. The original abstract of that was University of Minnesota Morrill Land Grant property. And that was huge legislation as well in that same period with the Lincoln administration, because it put all these... And basically what that did is as much land went into the Land Grant Act as did the Homestead Act. And basically what occurred was the University of Minnesota, the university, and all the other land grants were allowed to sell this property, put it in trusts and funds, and that's what they've been living on for years and years and years.
And they built up the universities, and a lot of these were first geared towards agriculture.
Exactly, yeah. So education had a big role in all that too. So big growth period. But 10 years prior to that, I mean, the setting was there. McCormick developed the reaper. John Deere did a plow. We had a mower, all horse-drawn equipment. So we went through that period, 1860, 1870 to the early 1900s to 1920 with horse-drawn equipment. And so it was just a slow growth. And Minnesota benefited greatly from that as being kind of the wheat capital.
Right.
We weren't necessarily the wheat producer. We were the wheat miller. Right.
And it was coming all from
the Dakota Territory. Yep. And the interesting thing that people think, well, Dakotas got homesteaded. Dakotas really didn't get homesteaded. They were the source of the Bonanza farms. People in the early homestead time didn't think the Dakotas were much of a place to live, and it really wasn't. But Eastern wealthy Easterners, making the money out of steel or railroads at the time, bought huge tracts of land.
Okay.
And set up minimum 3,000 acres up to 14,000 acre farms, corporate farms. Communes were developed.
Okay, and what were these? Were these the workers then that worked
Absolutely,
the farm?
And centered around communities, all about 7 miles to 10 miles apart, because at that time that's how long it takes to get a horse from one. That's a day's drive with a horse.
Sure.
But that Bonanza period was a great period because all that wheat had to come down on the ox trail down to Minneapolis to get ground. And once it hit Minneapolis, of course, hit the Mississippi, out to the east.
Go everywhere else.
Exactly. It was huge for us. It just helped funnel more occupation and more revenue, and of course, when you look at what happened here in Minnesota, Minneapolis, I mean, McCormick Deering headquarters was in St. Paul, Minnesota.
Yeah.
Minneapolis Moline, St. Paul, Minnesota. It was just those kind of things happened there, and we were fortunate and lucky to be in this part of the world to achieve that. And then we went through a period of what we call the golden period of agriculture.
Okay. And what period are we looking at?
1910 to 1914.
Okay, so not that big a time
No,
span.
very short.
But you're
3 to 4 years.
But there's a specific reason why this 4-year period was.
It was in all economists' mind, and even people at the time, they looked back at that time and did the ratios and said there was more income generated, net income for farmers based on the acres we were operating, than any other period of time.
Wow.
We've never, in fact, and we call that time, the term they give that is called parity.
Okay.
And parity means that period from 1910 to 1914 where what the farmer received in terms of Farmgate price was the highest base per bushel on a net basis that he ever received before.
How is that determined? How is that price determined? Or
that price was determined based on the inputs and the money realized out and how fast would him to repay land. Okay. So you look, and if you drive around in rural, I don't care if it's Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and you look at these grand, square farmsteads,
right,
that you look at it, that would be a $300,000-$400,000 construction today. How could people afford that then? Those got built in 1910 and 1914.
Okay.
From little shacks, log cabins. There was that much money to be made in farming at the time.
Wow.
And it was wild. I mean, you can all point it back. And, of course, all the lumber came out of northern Minnesota through Stillwater, got milled, and
so this was kind of really a central place for a lot
Minnesota
of,
certainly was, absolutely.
A lot of what was happening during that time. What happened after, and the span only lasted 4 years?
Well,
what happened?
The world went into a minor recession, major recession worldwide, and then World War I came around.
Okay.
And then when veterans came back from the war, back to the farms, we then ended up with more surplus. And by 1920, 6 years later, we had dropped the commodity prices 53% in that 4-year time frame. Then 1929 rolls around, Great Depression. Mm-hmm. And my father was born in 1929, my mother was born in 1932, and as children we still listened to them talking about, as they grew up, hard times. My father's father lost his farm around Ellendale. My mother's father lost his farm around Kilkenny. And at that period of time, there was, during the Great Depression, 750 farmers alone left because of loss of farms. Nearly 1 million farmers in the Midwest.
Wow.
Huge numbers. It changed rapidly. And in that period, by 1932, we dropped another 50%.
So, I mean, you're talking from where they were
$1 corn to 10-cent corn a bushel.
Exactly.
And you hear guys in rough times. The hard times were that hard where it made sense to burn corn rather than try to sell it. It was more valuable as a fuel source. And times were tough. But New Deal legislation out of FDR established Conservation Service, and the first price payments to farmers came in that period from 1935 on.
Okay.
And interestingly enough, they looked at the period and said, okay, the payment given to farmers then was based on parity. That period of 1910 and 1914. Mm-hmm. So they were given payments to not expand. Okay.
And that would help keep the surplus down?
It would keep the surplus down and keep cash rolling into farms,
okay.
And that was a big deal.
Right.
And of course we didn't have the Dust Bowl affect us that much. It was dry up here, but it certainly wasn't as bad as it dramatically changed Kansas and Oklahoma.
Sure. So what was the difference? You know, obviously the Dust Bowl affected them tremendously down there. What was the difference between how that affected them down in Kansas?
We had a lot more livestock in this part of the world.
Okay.
We had a lot of dairy units. We had a lot of ground that was still in pasture, using alfalfa, small grains. And you look at the agriculture out of Kansas and Oklahoma then, all they were doing was raising wheat. They weren't livestock intensive at all. And a lot of the ground was exposed to
the winds.
The winds.
Yep.
Yeah, and our soils were left intact because we had a lot of cover crops. And that was a big deal for us. I mean, livestock has always been a big factor for us being profitable around this part of the world, and it remains so, but it's being challenged lately. And then, of course, World War II rolled along, and absolutely everything was put into the war effort. And
how did the war affect farming, agriculture?
it was kind of a standstill period.
Okay, so nothing really changed?
No, nothing really changed. We did, though, starting in the 1930s, mid-30s more through the 40s, tractors were becoming more and more popular. We were seeing displacement of horses with tractors in the 30s and 40s.
What was the driving force behind that, changing from literal horsepower to...
Right. Well, I think roads were a big factor in all of that as well. And distribution and parts, and the whole thing that comes along with a sector of business and industry that has to support mechanization, a tractor that needs repairs, it needs maintenance, it needs to be sold, and businesses set up for that versus livery stable and feed your horse. I mean, it just, my father would be 80 this year. He grew up working for a farmer when he was 12, 13. He started with a horse, and that would have been 40.
Okay.
1935 to 1940, somewhere in there. So that was kind of the period where there were horses, or there was a two-cylinder John Deere, or an old Case, or an old Farmall out there.
Okay.
And then
after the war, then.
Well, then we saw huge improvements in the technology that came out of the war and pre-war, diesel, hydraulics, implements, hybrid seed got developed in the late 30s and 40s, and that period really defined 1950 on to about 1960, a 10-year period there we call the Green Revolution. And at the end of that period, we were able to feed 87 people, one farmer, 87 people.
Wow.
And prior to that period, it was 1 to 20. So the hybrid seed was a big development. Educational efforts from the Extension Service, along with curriculums in colleges and universities, land grants, but fertilizers, nitrogen, commercial fertilizers, discovery of phosphates, along with, and let's not forget, pesticides.
Right.
2,4-D was introduced. The first herbicide being able to be used out there was introduced, I believe, in 1948 or 52, somewhere in there. DDT, one of the first insecticides that were used.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
The famous
period.
DDT.
Oh yeah, the famous DDT. But you put all those in combination, and that was really the Green Revolution. And prior to that, there really wasn't a sector called agribusiness. There wasn't an industry called agribusiness.
Right.
That was really the birth of the agribusiness industry.
Because you had all these industries that were now creating tractors. You had the farm equipment. You had the fertilizers, the pesticides, all these things that farmers are now using to support.
Yeah.
It's now a full-fledged industry.
Exactly. What may have been a livery stable and that was primarily in selling grain and taking care of horses, moved itself into a mercantile, which moved itself into eventually a co-op, and it just, it's just a slow growth, but it changed us around here, and it gave a lot of opportunities for young people to go into the industry.
Right.
Because today, if there's an opportunity for someone out of agriculture, it's going to be the agribusiness, the supporting industries.
And to step back a little bit, you were saying one farmer could support 87 people.
Yeah.
How many farmers were there around this point? I mean, were we having a surplus of food creating at this point?
We did. And that's why in the Eisenhower administration, we had the first set-aside program where we were taking acres and setting them aside.
Okay.
Not doing anything with them. We had the first installment of the Commodity Credit Corporation, which built bins, Butler bins, all over the Midwest for grain storage. Everybody would buy the grain, we'd store the grain. There's still half a dozen bins out by south of Owatonna that are still standing there from what was done in 1959 and 1958. And we went through a small recession at the time, too. Times are tough.
Sure.
At the start of the Kennedy administration was a real robust period, got us out of that post-Korea War depression. That's what it was, a recession, depression. And so the stage was really set for us. We started overproducing. Land gets set aside. We started getting more and more payments. And then I won't forget a drive to Marshall, Minnesota between my freshman and sophomore year in college in July something, and heard the announcement that Nixon had just struck a deal with the USSR to sell wheat.
And what did that mean for the United States?
It was a signal to us to raise as much as we could. Earl Butz was the Commissioner of Agriculture at the time, and his comment was, get big or get out, to every U.S. farmer. And there was a signal there then that was given, and that really started our capital-intensive. Money started being a big issue because now we're going to start acquiring land. Land prices went up, land rents went up, equipment was sold left and right, and the sky was the limit. Euphoria until the grain embargo got put out in the 80s by the Carter administration. At the same time, we had the first reserve share under the Reagan administration. We had 20% interest because it was the early 80s and we had recession again. 700. We nearly lost. And of course that was the farm crisis of the 80s.
Right.
And 10,000 farmers in Minnesota alone went bankrupt and left farming. And but things settled down. Farmland peaked in 1987 at $2,200 an acre. 5 years later, farmland's at $600 an acre.
Wow.
20% of what it was 4 years previous to that. And everything was built on leveraged high-value land. Couldn't make payments when commodities dropped after the embargo. 20% interest.
Yep.
Couldn't make the payments.
So was the start of selling our crops to the USSR, did that start kind of, not to get too far off topic, but supplying food to other countries with aid?
That really started in the Kennedy administration, the initiation of the Peace Corps.
Okay.
Peace Corps, along with, but USAID got created in the
because that's kind of always been a big thing that a big point of pride among farmers, that we can feed the world, basically, and so that started. You're saying kind of with the Kennedy administration and the idea of the Peace Corps.
Right.
Okay. All right.
And the USSR experiment failed. They couldn't feed themselves.
Yeah.
And that was really the start of their downfall when they had to buy grain from us.
Wow.
We poured a lot of money into the whole Star Wars effort, and the Reagan administration really didn't need to.
It just came down to
it started earlier before
down
that.
to wheat.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the change of wheat? Maybe some different crops. We were talking about the hybrid seed.
Earlier. Yeah. And really the most recent change we've seen has been this in this century now, starting in as early as 1997, genetically modified crops.
Okay.
And that's now we're manipulating with biotechnology, and this is what I don't know people want to call it biotech revolution, but by gene splicing, we're adding in corn borer resistance and rootworm resistance and Roundup herbicide resistance and Liberty herbicide resistance, what we call a four-way stack in corn. It's been out there for a couple of years. We're planting, and I'll call it 100% of our beans in the Midwest are Roundup Ready beans, genetically modified. Some people plant conventional beans because there's a market for it, but the predominant market is that.
So what
corn
is that?
Moved there as well.
What does that mean, Roundup Ready?
Roundup Ready? Oh, that's why if you ever did a field drive 20 years ago around southern Minnesota, we'd be pulling weeds out of beans.
Sure.
Okay, we don't do that anymore.
Exactly.
We've got a herbicide that goes out there and kills everything but the soybean plant. Goes out there and kills everything but the corn plant.
Sure. And that has really kind of happened in the last 10,
10 years.
10 years even.
1997 was the first year where we saw 10 to 15% of the beans with the gene inserted. By year 2001, 2002, we were pushing 100%. Without a doubt, the most rapidly adopted technology farmers have ever used have been the GMOs. We've never seen an adoption that quick in 2 to 3 years of any, I don't care what, if it was mechanization, if it was this, was that.
Right.
This was amazing.
Yeah, because you were talking about, earlier we were talking about the tractors and the mechanization, and that was taking, starting
10,
in the
20,
30s.
30 years.
Exactly.
Exactly.
And now we're talking about 10 years, and you were just saying 100% of
Right.
beans are close to it.
And it's not only biotechnology, it's our ability to auto-steer and globally position ourselves with satellites, knowing within 2 inches in a field where we are. So we can map our fields, put it on Autosteer, drive straight, tractor turns around at the end, comes back. One of my farmers adopted this Autosteer technology and uses it on his planter. And he says, I love it, Gene. The only problem I have is at 2 in the afternoon, I can't stay awake in the tractor. Because, my son is a technician with Northfield Tractor, and 2 years ago, one of his jobs, they were putting a lot of Autosteer units on that spring. And he came in one day and he says, Dad, I put an Autosteer unit on for a gentleman who was 82 years old. I said, how do you like it? He said, he loved it. I said, you realize, Rick, that this gentleman started with a horse.
Wow.
And he adopted this technology, Autosteer. And so we're electronically monitoring grain yields. We're integrating those in with mapping, digital mapping records. We're integrating that with the varieties we select.
Yeah.
With the variable, we can change the rate that we're planting our seeds with.
So, I mean, it's changed tremendously.
Dramatically
even
in 5 years.
Oh, my
We've
gosh.
seen tremendous change in 5 years.
And believe
An
it or
adoption of
yeah,
technology.
And believe it or not, in the last half hour, we've covered almost 300 years of farming. So
my son goes out and fixes equipment now. I don't care if it's a tractor or a combine. The first thing he takes out is his laptop.
Wow.
And he plugs in with his sensor unit, find what sensor's wrong. That's the first thing he does.
Wow. Thank you very much, Gene, for sharing your information tonight. And thank you for joining us. And remember, for more information, log on to ksmq.org and click on Farm Connections. For all of us at KSMQ and Farm Connections, thank you and have a good night.